The morning light had barely lifted over the quiet stretches of Fairfax County when this story, one that had drifted through more than 5 decades of silence, began to re-enter the world with new meaning. For so long it had existed only as a shadowed mystery. The kind of case spoken about in small circles of investigators, old archivists who refused to let go, and families who wondered whether an unidentified child might somehow, painfully, be their own. But today, the truth was no longer hiding. After more than 50 years, the little boy, once known only as a nameless John Doe, finally had his name returned to him, and with that, the first fragile threads of his stolen story were starting to reweave themselves. This is darkcasedesk, and before we move forward, please take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive documentary into the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Now, let's step back in time, far back, to the early summer of the year, 1972, when a teenage boy pedaled his bicycle like he had done so many times before, unaware that in just a few seconds, he was about to come face to face with the image that would haunt an entire community for decades. It was a warm, still afternoon in the area of Lorton, a small but historically rich corner of Fairfax County, Virginia. The landscape carried the quiet kind of beauty that appeared unchanged by time. Gentle bends of road, clusters of heavy green trees, the echoing rumble of cars crossing old bridges, and beneath them the soft but steady trickle of small creeks like Massie Creek. But on this day, the familiar sounds and the predictable movements of an otherwise ordinary summer moment were interrupted. The teenager, whose name has never been released publicly, was riding across the old Colchester Road bridge when something in the water below caught his attention. At first, it was just a shape, a pale form lying in the shallow current. Maybe driftwood, he thought. Maybe a discarded object. But something felt wrong. Something told him this wasn't debris carried by the creek. As he slowed his bike and leaned over to look more carefully, he realized with a jolt of horror that the shape was a child, a little boy. The boy in the creek was naked, small, and terribly still. The teen's heart thundered as he immediately recoiled, nearly falling from his bicycle. He turned and pedaled as fast as he could toward home, adrenaline pushing him forward. The moment he burst through the door, he cried out to his mother, the words tumbling and breaking under fear as he tried to tell her what he had seen. His mother did not hesitate. She called authorities at once. The teenager could never have imagined that he had just discovered one of the region's most haunting mysteries, one that would stretch across generations and leave police, families, and entire communities searching for answers. But the wheels of that search began turning the moment Fairfax County investigators arrived at the waters of Massie Creek. The small body was recovered with care. Even seasoned officers felt an ache as they looked at the boy. The child was incredibly young, estimated between 3 and 6 years old, and completely unclothed. There were no belongings, no identifying marks, no signs of who he might be, nothing that could answer the heartbreaking question, who was this little boy? An autopsy provided the first grim certainty. The child had been murdered. He had suffered blunt force trauma, an unmistakable sign that someone had intentionally taken his life. Investigators quickly concluded that this was not an accident, not a natural tragedy. Someone had been responsible for killing this child, and then discarding his small body in a creek, leaving him alone in a place where no one would know his name. Authorities hoped that news of a missing child might surface in the following hours or days. Someone had to be missing him. A family member, a neighbor, a teacher, someone. But calls did not come. No one claimed him. And as the hours turned into days, the days into weeks, the weeks into months, it became hauntingly clear. Whoever should have been looking for this little boy was either gone, unable to speak, or unwilling to come forward. The year 1972 was a time before DNA testing, before computerized databases, before online archives and rapid information sharing. Identifying a child without clothing, documents, distinctive scars, or dental records meant investigators had very few options. Posters could be printed, descriptions could be released. But without someone recognizing him, there was little else they could do. The boy was buried in Coleman Cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia. He had no name, so the community gave him one, a placeholder, a symbolic acknowledgement that he existed, that he mattered. Over time, he became known as John Lorton Doe, or sometimes John Fairfax Doe, reflecting the area where he was found. His grave became a quiet reminder that somewhere, this little boy had a story. Somewhere he had a family. Somewhere he had once laughed, cried, played, and lived before someone chose to silence him. As the years passed, the case grew cold. Files were archived. Officers retired. But even as the decades rolled by, there were always people who refused to let him slip into oblivion. Some were investigators. Some were volunteers. Some were genealogists. Some were strangers who simply cared. Their efforts spread across generations, kept a faint thread of hope alive. In the early 2000s, that hope flickered again. In the year 2003, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, known widely as NCMEC, created a digital facial reconstruction of the boy. They produced a computer-generated image representing what he might have looked like when alive. It wasn't perfect, no reconstruction ever is, but it offered the world a glimpse at a face that had been absent for more than 30 years. The image was released publicly, sparking renewed interest. Tips came in. People wondered whether the little boy could be a long-missing child from their neighborhood. A relative, a child they had once seen reported missing. But each promising lead slowly fell apart under scrutiny. None of the tips matched. The boy remained unidentified. Meanwhile, buried deep within the original case file, investigators discovered something they had not expected. A small, nearly forgotten packet containing specks of hair, just tiny fragments, barely visible, almost like razor stubble. Forensic experts doubted the samples were sufficient. They explained that they usually required strands at least 2 centimeters in length, while these fragments were barely measurable. Still, the hair was sent to a forensic laboratory. Amazingly, despite their doubts, the experts managed to extract mitochondrial DNA from the tiny samples. While mitochondrial DNA is not as definitive as nuclear DNA, it still offered a genetic thread. Thin, fragile, but precious. With that thread, investigators waited. They needed more advanced technology. They needed genealogical science to evolve. And so the case, once again, rested. But the seed had been planted. One day, those tiny hair fragments would help reveal a truth no one had been able to uncover for 50 years. More than 40 years after the boy's discovery, NCMEC's Team Atom, a specialized unit made up of retired law enforcement officers who assist in cold cases, took renewed interest. They considered the possibility of exhuming the child's remains, hoping modern technology could produce nuclear DNA. But a severe obstacle stood in their way. No one could locate his exact burial site. Old records were incomplete, and storms had damaged the cemetery over the years. Without knowing where he rested, they could not exhume him. For now, the mitochondrial DNA was all they had. Around that same time, 2 possible matches seemed promising. A 3-year-old named Solomon, missing since April of 1972, and a 4-year-old named George, missing since April of 1969. The timelines fit. Their ages fit. Their demographics fit. But DNA comparisons ruled both out. The unidentified boy was not Solomon, nor George. Both of those children remain missing to this day. In the year 2021, a major breakthrough occurred. The hair samples finally processed with advanced DNA technology produced a viable profile. This profile was handed to Innovative Forensic Investigations, a team specializing in forensic genealogy. Through meticulous tree building and DNA matching, genealogists discovered a potential match, a maternal relative living in Philadelphia. Investigators traveled to speak with the woman. She shared pieces of her family history, including her sister Vera, who had died decades earlier. Vera had 2 young sons in the early 1970s, Carl, born in the late 1960s, and James, born in early 1972. This revelation changed everything. To confirm the connection, authorities sought to compare Vera's DNA with the John Doe's. Since she had passed in the year 1980, investigators exhumed her remains in 2023. After 2 rounds of testing, the results arrived in April of 2025. The boy in the creek was indeed Vera's son. The unidentified child, nameless for more than 50 years, was Carl Matthew Bryant. Carl was only 4 years old when he died. The revelation was devastating, but it was also the first true step toward justice. Finally, Carl was no longer just a case number or a faceless reconstruction. He was a child with a name, a history, a family who remembered him, and a story that demanded to be told. When Carl Bryant's name was finally spoken aloud at that press conference, it was as though 50 years of dense fog had suddenly lifted. It did not erase the tragedy, nor did it soften the horror of what happened to him, but it restored something every person deserves: identity. It restored dignity to a little boy who had been buried without a name, mourned without a history, and remembered only by the location of his death. Now, those who spoke for him could finally speak for Carl, a real child who had lived, who had family, and who had been taken long before he had any chance to experience the world waiting ahead of him. Investigators spent countless hours retracing the newly uncovered fragments of Carl's life. They interviewed relatives, sifted through old records, studied timelines, and attempted to understand the events of June of 1972, events that had been obscured by silence, fear, misdirection, and the simple passing of time. They learned that Carl's mother, Vera Bryant, had left Philadelphia with her 2 sons and her boyfriend, a man named James Hedgepath. Hedgepath was not the biological father of either boy, but he was the one leading the trip. He had told Vera's family they were going to Virginia to visit some of his relatives. But something happened along the way, something unthinkable. When Vera and Hedgepath returned to Philadelphia, the children were not with them. They told relatives that the boys had stayed behind in Virginia with Hedgepath's family. It was a claim that sounded strange, confusing, but no one pushed hard enough at the time to uncover the truth buried under that explanation. Relatives had spent decades wondering about Carl and James. Did they grow up somewhere? Did they stay in Virginia? Did they have lives of their own? It was a haunting uncertainty that aged with every passing year. But now, investigators understood the horrible reality. Carl had died along the route between Pennsylvania and Virginia. His tiny body had been discarded in Massie Creek. And baby James, the younger brother, only 6 months old, was nowhere to be found. The more investigators learned about Hedgepath, the darker the story became. He had a history of violence, including a murder conviction from the 1960s. His past suggested a man capable of terrible acts, a man whose internal storms had never settled. Whether Vera feared him, was controlled by him, or willingly participated in what happened, investigators could not say with certainty. Both she and Hedgepath were long deceased. But what they did know was this: Carl did not die alone. He was with adults who should have protected him, adults who should have kept him safe, adults who should have loved him. Instead, someone ended his life. The revelation that these adults returned to Philadelphia without the children and offered such a flimsy explanation was painful for the surviving family members to accept. It meant they had lived their entire lives with a story that wasn't true. It meant they had never been given the chance to say goodbye. It meant they had spent years imagining Carl somewhere in the world, perhaps growing older, perhaps starting a family, perhaps living a life with no idea that he had been gone since June of 1972. Investigators explained that Carl's death was likely not the only tragedy. They strongly suspected that 6-month-old James had also been killed. It is possible he was sold into another home and grew up without ever knowing his origins, but authorities, weighing the evidence, believe the darker possibility is more likely. Without remains, without a grave, without records, the truth about James may remain buried forever, unless someone comes forward, or unless another unidentified infant from the 1970s is eventually matched to him. When Carl's identity was released publicly, Fairfax County detectives shared a route map, an approximation of the path Vera and Hedgepath likely took during their journey to Virginia. The route stretched from Philadelphia, through Maryland, and into Virginia. Somewhere along that path, both children disappeared. Somewhere along that path, Carl was killed. Somewhere along that path, an infant boy was either taken, sold, or murdered. Investigators appealed to the public. They asked anyone who might have known Hedgepath or Vera during the early 1970s to step forward, even if their memories felt small or insignificant. Sometimes the smallest detail can break open the largest mysteries. They asked officials across multiple states to review unidentified remains from the era, especially infants discovered between 1971 and 1973. They asked genealogists, archivists, and private citizens to spread Carl's story in hopes of bringing awareness, compassion, and perhaps a new lead. For so many decades, Carl had been left unidentified, and yet so many people had quietly cared about him. A local church group had cared enough to give him a burial when no one else could. Investigators had cared enough to preserve his case file. Forensic experts cared enough to attempt DNA recovery from hair fragments most labs would have dismissed. Genealogists cared enough to spend hundreds of hours building family trees, checking matches, eliminating false leads, and chasing one fragile clue after another. And now, 53 years after his death, people who had never met Carl stood in silence at the press conference, moved by the knowledge that this child had been alone for so long. But he was no longer alone. He had a name, he had a story, and the world was finally listening. As Carl's relatives learned the truth about what happened, their grief was tangled with confusion, anger at the adults who had been responsible for him, sorrow for the years that had passed without answers, and heartbreak at realizing that Carl had not lived the life they had imagined for him. Some had grown up believing his absence was temporary, believing that life and distance had simply separated them. Instead, they discovered that he had been gone before they had even understood the concept of loss. One of the saddest parts of this story is the uncertainty surrounding Carl's final resting place. Investigators still cannot precisely locate the original burial plot in the cemetery because of damaged records and storm destruction. The grave may be close by, but its exact position has been lost to time. In an effort to honor him, the cemetery plans to install a dedication bench engraved with his true name, Carl Matthew Bryant, so even if his grave cannot be pinpointed, his memory can be preserved in a place of peace. What makes Carl's case so deeply painful is that it reflects a truth that investigators know too well. Some children disappear not because they wander off or are taken by strangers, but because the people who were supposed to protect them failed them in the most devastating way. Cases like these leave an imprint not only on investigators, but on society as a whole. They remind us that the most vulnerable can be harmed by the very people meant to keep them safe. And yet, Carl's story is also a testament to the power of persistence. Forensic genealogy is one of the most remarkable tools in modern investigation. It turns a sliver of DNA into a roadmap of relatives, patterns, and clues. It takes patience, precision, and the emotional endurance to follow countless false paths before finding the true one. The scientists and genealogists who worked on Carl's case understood the weight of their task. They were not merely identifying remains. They were giving a child a voice after half a century of silence. The process was not simple. Genealogists built family trees from every mitochondrial match, tracing lines through marriage records, birth certificates, census data, and decades of stored documents. They studied names, relationships, and common ancestors. They followed distant branches of genetic connections until they found one that made sense: a maternal aunt in Philadelphia. That single living clue led them down a path to uncovering Vera's family, Carl's birth records, and his younger brother. From there, investigators sought confirmation through direct DNA comparison. They contacted surviving relatives. They requested swabs. They verified documents. They scrutinized the timeline of Vera's life and movements. They reviewed Hedgepath's criminal history, seeking patterns. Eventually, they made the decision to exhume Vera's remains, to obtain a direct sample. It was a step that required time, court approval, and immense care. But it was the only way to remove all doubt. The results spoke the truth that the world needed. The little boy found in Massie Creek in June of 1972 was Vera's child, and his name was Carl. This should have been the moment of resolution, but instead, it opened a new wave of sorrow. Because the truth, when finally revealed, does not always bring closure. Sometimes it brings more questions, more grief, and more weight. It forces us to confront what might have happened in those unseen moments between Philadelphia and Virginia, in the backseat of a car, on the side of a road, or in a stranger's home. It forces us to imagine the fear and confusion a young child must have felt in his final hours. And yet, Carl's story is also a reminder of the thousands of unidentified children whose names have not yet been restored. His case is a symbol of what can happen when science, determination, and compassion intersect. Here on Dark Case Desk, we tell these stories because they deserve space. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be remembered. And if stories like Carl's can help even one child, one family, or one case find its way forward, then speaking them aloud matters more than ever. Before we continue deeper into the second half of this 15,000-word narrative, please remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button. It helps us bring more awareness to forgotten victims and long cold cases that still deserve justice. Carl's identification, while monumental, was only the beginning of the truth the investigation had uncovered. What came after what investigators pieced together about his final days and the movements of the adults around him is a timeline filled with shadow, panic, and lingering unknowns. And to understand how a child ends up 3 states away from home, unnamed for 50 years, we must trace the path step by step, through each decision and each silence that allowed this tragedy to remain hidden for so long. And so, we continue. Carl's story, now partially illuminated, left investigators in a space between clarity and painful uncertainty. They had a name finally, a name and a timeline stitched together from scattered pieces of testimony, DNA evidence, historical documents, and the reluctant memories of people connected to Vera and her boyfriend during that haunting period in the early 1970s. But identifying Carl was only the first fragile layer of truth. Beneath it was a far heavier question, the question that had lingered for 53 years. How exactly did a little boy leave Philadelphia alive and end up dead in a creek in Fairfax County? And what became of his baby brother, 6-month-old James? The gravity of that mystery weighed heavily on the shoulders of every investigator who worked on the case. It was not simply an unsolved homicide. It was a story of 2 children who vanished from the world without a trace. Not through disappearance, but through erasure. Erasure from family, from records, from safety. Carl's death was a confirmed horror. But the silence around James was a wound that had never closed. It still hasn't. To understand the emotional and psychological landscape of this case, one must return to the world as it existed in the early 1970s, when many neighborhoods were shaped by close-knit families, simple routines, and a societal innocence that had not yet fractured under the scrutiny of modern technology. In 1972, it was tragically common for children to go missing without broader public awareness. There were no digital alerts, no social media, no instantaneous transfer of information. If a child went missing in one state and a body was found in another, the link between the two often evaporated in the gaps between jurisdictions. This reality created the perfect storm for cases like Carl's. A child could be murdered in one area and disposed of in another without raising a widespread alarm. And when the guardians responsible for that child were the very ones who caused the harm, they could weave narratives for their relatives that no one dared to question deeply enough. The idea that a mother could return home without her children and claim they stayed behind with someone else was disturbing, but in some families, especially families with complicated histories or strained relationships, such claims were accepted quietly, even reluctantly. No one imagined the truth was darker than the explanation offered. But time revealed that the truth was horrifyingly darker. Investigators needed to reconstruct the final days of Carl's life, and the only way to do that was to trace the movements of Vera and Hedgepath. They began in Philadelphia, where relatives confirmed the couple had left the city with both children. There was no record of Carl or James being seen in public during the supposed trip, no sightings at rest stops, no witnesses recalling a young mother with 2 children and a man with a violent criminal past passing through. It was as though the boys were invisible, and invisibility, in the world of true crime, is almost always a sign of danger. Fairfax County detectives believe the boys did travel with Vera and Hedgepath at the beginning of the journey. But at some point along the route, likely in rural Maryland or Virginia, something happened. Whether it was a sudden act of violence, prolonged abuse, or a planned decision, investigators cannot yet say, but the result was the same. Carl's life was taken, and his little brother's fate spiraled into darkness, with no documented trace. One of the strongest possibilities, supported by the evidence and historical behaviors of offenders like Hedgepath, is that an argument or violent incident occurred in the car. Hedgepath's criminal record from the 1960s was not just a footnote. It was a blueprint of a dangerous man with a proven history of lethal violence. He had been convicted of murder. He had the capacity to kill. He had demonstrated patterns of aggression and dominance. Investigators had every reason to focus heavily on him as the likely perpetrator. But Vera's role in all of this cannot be dismissed. Whether she was a victim, a participant, or a silent witness remains unknown. Detectives do not have enough evidence to claim she caused Carl's death, but they cannot ignore the fact that she returned home without him and without any signs of distress. She lived for 8 more years carrying that secret, if not an active role. She told relatives a story about the boy staying behind with Hedgepath's family, a narrative that investigators now know was entirely fabricated. That level of deception requires either fear or complicity, or both. Forensic genealogy had done the extraordinary work of bringing Carl's name back into the light, but the emotional burden of what that revealed fell heavily on his surviving family members. Imagine believing for decades that your nephews were somewhere in the world, maybe distant, maybe estranged, maybe unreachable, but alive. And then, more than half a century later, learning that one had been murdered as a child, and the other likely never survived past infancy. That type of grief hits with a force that cannot be measured. The Sissons Haster. We want now our 1940 dots. It is grief doubled by time, intensified by the betrayal of adults who should have protected them, magnified by the knowledge that the truth was buried beneath lies for an entire lifetime. When authorities shared their findings with the family, the response was a mixture of devastation and reluctant relief. Devastation, because the truth was unbearable. Relief, because after 50 years of wondering, they finally had a certainty, even if it was the worst kind. They could say Carl's name. They could acknowledge his existence. They could recognize him as part of their family. And that, after so long, mattered deeply. The community felt that weight as well. A child found alone in a creek had lived in memory as a nameless symbol, a reminder of the fragility of childhood and the cruelty of some crimes. When his name was revealed to be Carl, people who had never known him felt an emotional connection they hadn't expected. He was no longer a mystery. He was a child with a history, a baby with a birth certificate, a little boy who once laughed, cried, touched someone's hand, or reached out for comfort. He was real. The press conference in July of 2025 was a somber, powerful moment. Members of the Bryant family attended, carrying decades of unspoken grief on their shoulders. They listened as investigators recounted the long path that led from unidentified remains to a named child. They heard Carl's name spoken aloud in a room full of strangers, reporters, forensic experts, and detectives. For the first time in half a century, he was recognized, acknowledged, and honored. Nearby, a bench was planned for installation at Coleman Cemetery, a place to carry Carl's true name into the future, even if his exact burial plot could not be found. The loss of burial records due to storm damage was an unfortunate reminder of how fragile historical documentation can be. But the bench was more than a marker. It was a declaration. Carl is no longer forgotten. Investigators vowed to continue searching for answers about baby James. They encouraged law enforcement agencies in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to re-examine unidentified infant remains discovered in the early 1970s. Some infants found during that era were never identified, never connected to a missing child, never returned to a family. It is possible one of those infants could be James. But without DNA comparisons or preserved remains, that possibility hangs in a liminal space, waiting for science or fate to catch up. The truth about cases like this is that closure is rare. Even when answers are found, they often lead to deeper questions. How many people knew what happened? Were there neighbors who sensed something was wrong? Did anyone see the couple during the trip? Was there a moment where someone could have intervened? And why did Vera live the rest of her life without ever speaking the truth? These questions form the emotional architecture of Carl's story. On one side, there is the cold, procedural work of investigation, gathering evidence, analyzing DNA, building genealogical maps, reconstructing timelines. On the other side, there is the human element, the silence of a mother, the violence of a boyfriend, the confusion of relatives, the shock of discovery. and the overwhelming sorrow of realizing the children you thought were alive never made it past early childhood. When forensic genealogy began providing answers, investigators were struck by how fragile the thread of truth really was. If those tiny fragments of hair had not been preserved, if the lab had not successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA, if genealogists had overlooked a single connection, if Vera's remains had not been exhumable, if the maternal aunt had not provided valuable information, if even one step along this chain had failed, Carl might have remained unidentified forever. This is why persistence matters in cold cases. Investigators know that every detail, every scrap of evidence, every faded photograph, every brittle strand of hair has the potential to rewrite history. Carl's identification did not happen because of one breakthrough. It happened because dozens of people over several decades refused to give up. That kind of dedication is what transforms tragedies into truths, mysteries into memories, and nameless victims into remembered individuals. As detectives continued exploring the timeline of Carl's final days, they encountered another heartbreaking realization. Carl likely suffered. The blunt force trauma that caused his death was not instantaneous. The medical examiner from 1972 was limited by the technology of the time, but modern analysis of the autopsy report revealed indicators of significant impact. The fact that Carl was found unclothed in the creek suggests an attempt to conceal evidence or discard a child in a place where scavenging animals or strong currents might obscure the cause of death. This level of disregard for a child's body is consistent with offenders attempting to hide crimes quickly, often in the heat of panic, rage, or fear of discovery. It is unlikely the disposal was carefully planned. Instead, investigators believe it was impulsive or immediate, possibly following an argument, an outburst, or a brutal episode of violence. Carl's small size meant he could be carried easily. A creek like Massie Creek, shallow but isolated beneath an old bridge, offered a place to abandon a body without drawing attention. That bridge, now decades older, still stands as a silent witness to what happened. People drive over it every day, unaware that beneath it lies a piece of history, a place where a teenager once stopped his bicycle, looked down, and saw the end of a little boy's life. And for the investigators who revisit that bridge as part of their work, it represents not just the location of Carl's death, but the beginning of his long path to identification. It was the place where his story emerged from the shadows, where the world first learned of his existence, even if it could not yet learn his name. In examining the many layers of Carl's case, detectives discovered that there were missed opportunities along the way. In 1972, national missing children's databases did not exist. Cross-referencing between states was slow and inconsistent. When Carl's body was found, no immediate match was made to any missing child. But the deeper tragedy was that Carl had never been reported missing at all. His disappearance was concealed. His death was hidden behind lies. This absence of a missing person report eliminated the most crucial tool investigators rely on when identifying bodies. The lack of a missing report is a chilling reality in some child homicide cases. When a guardian is responsible for the death or complicit in covering it up, they simply do not report the child missing. Instead, they create stories to divert suspicion. The child is staying with relatives. The child moved to a new home. The child is with their other parent. The child is being cared for elsewhere. In cases where families have strained relationships or limited communication, such lies can go unchallenged for years. In Carl's case, the lie went unchallenged for more than half a century. This is why forensic genealogy has become a revolutionary tool. It bypasses silence. It bypasses lies. It bypasses the failures of past systems. DNA has no allegiance to deception. It reveals bloodlines, ancestry, and truth, even when human beings try desperately to bury it. As the narrative of Carl's final days becomes clearer, investigators acknowledge that there are limits to what they may ever learn. Hedgepath is deceased. Vera is deceased. Anyone who might have witnessed aspects of the trip is likely elderly or gone. Most physical evidence has vanished. Objects that might have been crucial clothing, personal items, toys, blankets are lost to time. Even if someone remembered the couple traveling with children, unless they came forward during the investigation, that memory has remained unspoken. Yet Carl's story is not one of hopelessness. It is a story of reclaiming identity, restoring dignity, and proving that even when a case goes cold for more than 50 years, it can still thaw under the warmth of relentless dedication. It is a story of community, local church members who ensured Carl had a burial, genealogists who used science to resurrect his past, investigators who carried his file across generations, and ordinary people who now carry his memory in their thoughts, hearts, and conversations. Carl's identification also opens the door for justice, not legal justice, since the perpetrators are no longer alive to face trial, but emotional justice, historical justice, and moral justice. A wrong was uncovered. A truth was reclaimed. A silent child was given a voice. And while that does not undo the horror of what happened, it serves as a message to the world. Children like Carl deserve to be found, remembered, and honored. Their stories deserve to be told. As we move into the final act of this 15,000-word narrative, we will follow the investigators as they unravel the remaining unanswered questions, explore the broader implications of Carl's case, and reveal the lasting impact that identifying him has had on both forensic science and the community that unknowingly sheltered his memory for 53 years. The story of Carl Matthew Bryant had traveled across 50 years of silence, woven itself through generations of forensic science, and emerged into the present day with a name and a truth. But the true magnitude of Carl's case extends far beyond the identification of a single child. In many ways, his story acts as a mirror, reflecting the evolution of American investigative work, the desperate need for accountability in crimes against children, and the haunting realization that some cases remain cold, not because clues are lacking, but because the people who should have spoken chose instead to remain silent. Fairfax County detectives, standing at the podium in July of 2025, understood exactly what that silence meant. They understood the layers of history behind Carl's case. They understood the weight that had been carried by every investigator who handled the original file. And they understood that bringing Carl's truth into the light was not only about revealing who he was, but also acknowledging all the years he had been forgotten. It was a moment of recognition, perhaps decades overdue, but powerful nonetheless. For so long, Carl had existed only as a symbol, an unnamed child, a cold case, a tragic entry in a database. But now, he was a real boy, with a real identity, a real life, and a real family. In the world of cold case investigations, such victories are rare, and when they do occur, they are felt deeply by everyone involved. As the press conference unfolded, the detectives spoke with a tone shaped by equal parts relief and sorrow. They described the relentless efforts through the years, the difficult process of recovering mitochondrial DNA from hair samples nearly too small to analyze, and the astounding advances in forensic genealogy that finally connected a tiny genetic thread from the creek in 1972 to a living relative more than 5 decades later. They explained how exhuming the remains of Vera Bryant led to the irrefutable scientific link needed to confirm Carl's identity. Every step, every inch of progress had been slow, methodical, and emotionally exhausting. But behind every scientific detail was the human story of a little boy who had been denied the most basic compassion. Carl's body had been discarded in a creek, as if he were something to hide. His grave had been placed in a cemetery without a name because his identity had been stolen before investigators could protect it. For more than 50 years, his memory existed as a question mark. And yet, even in the absence of answers, people had cared. Local church members had cared enough to provide him a burial. Citizens had cared enough to keep asking questions. Forensic genealogists had cared enough to spend hundreds of hours piecing his identity together. And now, in the present day, entire communities cared enough to grieve a child most of them had never known existed. One of the most emotionally striking parts of Carl's story is the moment investigators approach the woman believed to be his maternal aunt. Imagine living your life unaware that your nephew, a child you likely remembered from early childhood photographs or vague memories, had died under such horrific circumstances. Imagine believing for 50 years that he had grown up elsewhere, possibly in Virginia, possibly living a quiet life just beyond your reach. And then imagine learning that he had been murdered when he was only 4 years old. The aunt's emotional reaction, though not publicly detailed, was described by investigators as profound. It pierced through time, collapsing decades of uncertainty into a single moment of truth. Carl had not lived in some distant part of Virginia. He had not grown up, had not started school, had not made friends, had not had birthdays or celebrations or late-night conversations with family members who wondered why they had lost touch. He had been gone since the summer of 1972. The family's grief was heavy, but it was also wrapped in gratitude. Gratitude for the investigators who never stopped caring. Gratitude for the scientists who extracted DNA from hair fragments that most labs would have dismissed as useless. Gratitude for the genealogists who navigated the labyrinth of historical documentation to find the truth. Gratitude that Carl could at last be claimed as one of their own. Some of the surviving family members had lived their entire adult lives carrying the assumption that Carl and James had simply grown up elsewhere. Some believe Vera's explanation that the boys had stayed behind in Virginia with Hedgepath's relatives. They had no reason to doubt her. They simply believed what they were told, unaware that beneath that simple explanation lay a devastating truth. And what makes this even more tragic is that it is unclear whether Vera ever showed guilt, remorse, or fear during the years that followed the trip to Virginia. Records show she had passed away by the year 1980, just 8 years after Carl's death. Leaving behind a legacy of silence, she had taken whatever truth she held to her grave. Whether she had been a victim of Hedgepath, a participant in the violence, or a mother too afraid to speak, those answers may never be known. But investigators believe strongly that she had knowledge of what happened. Whether she was powerless to stop it or complicit in it is a question that now belongs to history. And perhaps, in some ways, that uncertainty carries its own deep ache. People naturally want closure, clarity, and justice. They want to know who is responsible. But Carl's case offers no single villain, only the chilling realization that both adults on that trip may have played a role in the loss of 2 young lives. Hedgepath's past provided little comfort. His known history of violence created the strongest suspicion that he had been the one to inflict the fatal blow. His prior murder conviction established a disturbing pattern that aligned with what investigators believed had happened to Carl. And yet, without a confession, without testimony, without direct evidence beyond timeline and circumstance, the truth will remain forever buried beneath the weight of time. Investigators openly shared their belief that the odds of baby James surviving were extremely low. A 6-month-old infant is entirely dependent on adults for survival. For the child to have been permanently left with strangers would be rare, and for him to have been sold or given away without documentation would be an extraordinary anomaly. The likelihood that he died along the same route is far higher. And yet, the inability to locate his remains leaves a lingering question that investigators are determined to answer someday. They appealed to the public, specifically urging people who lived in or traveled through the area in the early 1970s to come forward if they remembered anything, no matter how trivial it seemed. They encouraged older residents to revisit memories of couples passing through, mothers with infants, or suspicious behavior at gas stations or motels. They requested that law enforcement agencies revisit old unidentified infant cases, some of which had been closed for decades without resolution. This renewed urgency brought attention to a broader crisis. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, infants and young children who were unidentified at death were often buried under placeholder names or stored in morgues until the trail turned cold. Their graves, much like Carl's, carried no identity. Their stories were never told, and their families, if they even knew the child was missing, were left without answers. In the wake of Carl's identification, several jurisdictions announced intentions to review their unidentified infant cases from the era. Advances in DNA analysis had made it possible to extract profiles from remains previously thought unusable. Forensic genealogy could now match distant relatives, even from degraded samples. Carl's case served as a symbolic reminder that it is never too late to reopen a file, never too late to give a name back to a child. And while Carl's identification was a triumph of science and persistence, it also highlighted the emotional devastation that follows in the wake of such revelations. Those who attended the press conference described a palpable quiet that settled over the room as his name was spoken, broken only by the sound of family members holding back tears. 50 years of absence. 50 years lost. 50 years in which the world moved forward, unaware that a small child's story had paused in the shadows. waiting for someone to find him. Cold cases are often misunderstood as puzzles waiting to be solved. But they are more than that. They are human stories, frozen in time, dependent on the compassion, curiosity, and commitment of people who refuse to forget. Carl's case revealed that even when decades pass, even when memories fade and evidence deteriorates, the pursuit of truth can still generate profound and meaningful discoveries. As the story gained momentum in the media, people from across the country expressed their condolences, their heartbreak, and their hopes for James. Many shared their astonishment that such a long cold case could be solved through hair fragments smaller than a grain of rice. Others expressed outrage that neither Vera nor Hedgepath had ever faced consequences. Some activists advocated for stronger protections for children, publicly acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that many child homicide victims are harmed by those within their own household. The emotional impact of Carl's story reached beyond law enforcement and extended into households everywhere. People talked about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. They talked about the need to revisit suspicious stories, especially involving children. They talked about how easy it can be to overlook signs of danger when trust, fear, or family loyalty obscure the truth. In reflecting on Carl's story, investigators often use one word: dignity. The dignity stolen from him when his life was taken. The dignity restored when his name was given back. The dignity that now surrounds efforts to locate his brother, honor his memory, and provide closure to those who mourn him. The bench that will bear his name in Coleman Cemetery serves as a physical reminder that he is no longer John Doe or John Fairfax Doe. He is Carl, a boy who should have grown up, a boy who should have been protected, a boy whose case reminds us all that truth, though sometimes buried deeply, has a way of emerging when people refuse to abandon the search. And here at Dark Case Desk, stories like Carl's are the reason we continue digging into the forgotten, the overlooked, the unresolved. Because every name returned, every truth uncovered, every identity restored matters. Every time we speak a victim's name, we give them something the world may have denied: remembrance. Before we conclude, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement helps bring attention to cases like Carl's and supports the ongoing mission to honor those who can no longer speak for themselves. As we return to the final emotional reflections on Carl's story, we are reminded that his identification does not mark the end of the journey. Instead, it marks a beginning, the beginning of recognition, the beginning of remembrance, and the beginning of long-delayed justice, even if not in a courtroom. Carl's life, though short, now resonates with meaning. His identity has been reclaimed. His story has been shared. And the silence that surrounded his death for 5 decades has been broken. His name is Carl Matthew Bryant. He was 4 years old. He was loved, even by those who had not yet known his truth. And despite the darkness that once concealed his story, he is now remembered not as an unidentified boy in a creek, but as a child whose existence had value, whose life mattered, and whose memory will endure through every person who hears his story. This is Dark Case Desk. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for helping ensure that children like Carl are never forgotten again.